A warm welcome, audience. What's time there and where are you from watching this video? Today, we step back into the blood-stained centuries of the Middle Ages, where shining armor and noble honor weren't what they seemed. When you imagine a knight, you see power, pride, and prestige, but the truth behind that steel mask was sweat, filth, pain, and fear. The medieval knight was the image of glory, but beneath the armor, he was just a man trapped by duty, violence, and endless war. The reality of knighthood was far darker than the legends ever dared to show. From the moment a boy was born into a noble house, his fate was sealed. If he was lucky or unlucky enough to be chosen for knighthood, his childhood vanished in discipline and pain. At the age of 7, he was sent away from home, stripped of comfort, and handed to a lord to serve as a page. His life became one of obedience, fetching armor, cleaning stables, serving meals, and sleeping on cold stone floors. The dream of knighthood began with servitude, not honor. Every dawn, the young page woke to the sound of bells and the weight of chores. His small hands were blistered by endless polishing of metal and leather. He watched real knights train with wooden swords and heavy shields, wondering if he would ever be strong enough. The instructors were merciless, striking at mistakes with canes and words sharper than blades. There was no room for weakness. A tear was a sin. Years passed and the boy grew into a squire. Now, his duty was to serve one knight directly, to clean his master's armor, carry his weapons, and follow him into battle. The smell of blood, sweat, and horses filled his days. Squires learned the art of war not from books, but from screams and wounds. They trained in full armor under the burning sun, collapsing in exhaustion while their lords watched without pity. To become a knight was supposed to be an honor, but it came with scars. When the ceremony of knighthood arrived, the squire knelt before his lord and swore an oath to protect the weak, to serve the church, to obey his master. Yet, in truth, many knights protected no one but their lord's lands and gold. Chivalry was a myth written by poets, not a reality lived by soldiers. Once knighted, life did not become easier. The armor, worth a small fortune, was heavier than most could bear. The full plate could weigh up to 50 pounds, turning every movement into agony. The inside of the armor trapped heat, sweat, and stench. Knights often fainted in the summer sun. They could barely see through the helmet's slit, and in the chaos of battle, many suffocated before they ever met their enemy. Feasts and songs made knighthood look glorious, but the daily life was brutal. Training was constant, jousting, swordplay, horsemanship, or dangerous, all exhausting. The war horse, or destrier, was a beast of muscle and temper, more expensive than a peasant's entire farm. A single injury to the horse could end a knight's career. And then there were the wars endless. Bloody wars, the 100 Years' War, the Crusades, battles over land and pride. Each one claimed thousands. The ground was soaked with blood. The air thick with smoke and screams. Armor shattered, swords broke, and bodies fell under the hooves of charging cavalry. For every knight who won glory, dozens rotted in forgotten fields. Food was another misery. In campaigns, knights ate moldy bread, dry meat, and whatever they could steal from villages. Disease spread faster than swords, dysentery, infections, plague. Even the rich could not escape the filth. Beneath their armor, lice crawled, and wounds festered. There were no doctors, only leeches and superstition. The code of chivalry preached purity, loyalty, and virtue, but reality was crueler. Knights looted villages, burned homes, and took what they pleased. Many were mercenaries, fighting for whoever paid most. The line between hero and villain was thin, often invisible. When peace came, it was not mercy. A knight without war was a knight without purpose. Many went broke maintaining armor, servants, and horses. Their fame faded and poverty followed. Some turned to crime, becoming bandits or hired blades. The same lords they once served forgot their names. And through it all, the people they were supposed to protect, the peasants, saw them not as saviors but as monsters wrapped in steel. Children hid when knights rode by. To the common folk, a knight meant taxes, pain, and fear. So, when we look at paintings of shining armor and grand tournaments, we see only the surface. The truth lies beneath in sweat-soaked linen, rusted steel, and broken oaths. The medieval knight's life was not noble. It was a lifetime of training, servitude, fear, and death. Every clang of metal was a reminder that beneath the armor was a man who bled, cried, and aged. The battlefield was his home, and glory his curse. Being a knight meant living every day one sword swing away from death, and knowing that history would remember only the victories, not the pain. That was the cruel paradox of knighthood, a life spent chasing honor, only to find horror waiting beneath the visor. Becoming a knight was not a reward, it was a lifetime of punishment disguised as glory. Every knight's story began with discipline, pain, and obedience. From the moment a young boy became a page, his identity was stripped away. His name mattered less than his master's commands, and every mistake was met with humiliation. He was taught not to think, only to obey, because in battle hesitation was death. The mind was beaten into submission before the sword was ever placed in his hand. Training began before dawn, and ended long after sunset. Boys practiced striking wooden posts until their arms went numb. They lifted stones to build strength, sparred with older squires who never went easy, and ran in armor heavier than their own bodies. Every bruise was a lesson, every scar a step closer to knighthood. They were taught to fight not just with swords but with discipline, to die standing rather than live dishonored. The weapons themselves were cruel teachers. A longsword demanded both strength and grace. Yet one mistake could break a finger or cut flesh through armor. The mace crushed bones. The lance shattered. Ribs and the bow, though rare for knights, taught precision and patience. They trained with blunt blades, but even those killed. Broken noses, split lips, and shattered pride filled the training grounds. Pain was a language every knight learned to speak fluently. The code of chivalry was carved into their minds like holy scripture. They swore to defend the weak, to protect the innocent, to honor their lord and their god. But even as they repeated the words, many knew that real life did not match those ideals. The weak were rarely protected, the innocent often burned, and honor was bought and sold like a weapon. Still, the oath was sacred, not for truth, but for identity. Without it, a knight was just a murderer with better equipment. Ceremonies made it all look noble. The knighting ritual, called dubbing, filled the halls with candles and prayers. A priest blessed the sword, the lord tapped the squire's shoulder, and the boy rose as a knight, a servant of faith and battle. But when the applause faded, reality returned. The new knight left the chapel to find debt waiting for him. His armor, horse, and servants had to be paid for, and the cost was unbearable. Many borrowed gold from merchants, selling future victories they might never live to see. The armor itself became both shield and prison. Underneath, the knight was a sweating, gasping man, muscles aching, skin blistered. The padding beneath the steel trapped heat like an oven, and the weight crushed his spine. In long marches, knights would collapse, their squires dragging them to shade. Even removing the armor was torture, the straps stuck to wounds, the smell of rust mixed with rot. Yet they wore it proudly, because to be seen without armor was to be seen as weak. When not at war, knights were expected to entertain their lords. They attended feasts, tournaments, and hunts, pretending to enjoy a life of privilege while hiding exhaustion. Jousting was the sport of death disguised as glory. Two men charged on horses at full speed, trying to break lances against each other's chests. Broken ribs, crushed jaws, and concussions were common, yet crowds cheered as if it were a festival. Many knights died not in battle, but in tournaments meant to celebrate peace. Every oath they swore chained them tighter to their lords. A knight did not belong to himself, his sword, his life. Even his soul were possessions of the man above him. Disobedience meant exile, dishonor, or execution, and the church was no refuge. Priests praised the sword when it served their cause and cursed it when it didn't. A knight lived trapped between faith and fear, loyalty and survival. For many, knighthood was not a calling, it was a curse. They could not escape it, nor could they stop serving. Even when crippled or maimed, they were expected to fight or train others to die in their place. Old knights became mentors, watching younger men fall into the same endless cycle. The code they had once believed in now felt like a cruel joke whispered by history. And as the centuries passed, the burden only grew heavier. Armor became thicker, weapons deadlier, wars bloodier. The knight's glory faded under gunpowder smoke. but the suffering remained. Their oaths still echoed, hollow promises spoken by men who no longer believed in them. Knighthood demanded everything and gave nothing in return. It was not a profession, but a slow death, one fought in silence beneath layers of iron and lies. The sword they carried was not just a weapon. It was a chain, gleaming, sacred, and unbreakable. For a medieval knight, war was not a moment in life, it was life itself. Peace was rare, and when it came, it only served as a pause before the next slaughter. From the frozen hills of Europe to the burning sands of the Holy Lands, knights were sent wherever their lords desired blood. They marched endlessly, armored and armed, bound by oaths they no longer believed in. Every road led to a battlefield, every dawn to another fight for someone else's ambition. The drums of war echoed long before the battle began. Knights spent weeks preparing, sharpening blades, repairing armor and blessing weapons in church halls. But no blessing could protect them from what was to come. The moment the banners rose and horns blew, fear filled every stomach. Beneath the visor, sweat dripped into their eyes. The world narrowed to the sound of hooves, steel, and screams. Battles were chaos, not glory. Dust blinded them, mud swallowed horses, and blood made the earth slick. One mistake, a loose strap, a cracked shield, meant death. They fought not against faceless enemies, but men just like themselves. Poor squires, desperate soldiers, forgotten sons. Every strike was a gamble, every heartbeat a question. Who would live long enough to see the sun again? The knight's armor, once a symbol of strength, became a cage of suffering. The weight dragged them down in the mud, and when they fell, they could not rise. Many drowned. Face first in blood and dirt, suffocating in the helmets meant to save them. The heat cooked their skin, the noise shattered their minds. When they removed their armor after battle, their bodies were covered in bruises and burns. And yet, war was never over. Lords demanded more lands, kings demanded more loyalty, and priests demanded holy vengeance. The Crusades promised salvation but delivered only death. Thousands of knights rode across deserts, believing they fought for God, yet most died from thirst, disease, or despair. Their bones still lie under foreign sands, forgotten by the kingdoms they served. In Europe, civil wars tore families apart. Knights who once trained together now slaughtered each other under different banners. Loyalty changed with gold, honor was measured in corpses. The peasants they claimed to protect hid in fear as armies burned their homes and took their daughters. Chivalry died long before the knights did. After every war, the survivors returned not as heroes, but as broken men. Their bodies bore scars too deep for medicine, their minds haunted by faces of the dead. Nightmares replaced sleep, guilt replaced faith. Many turned to drink, others to prayer, and some to madness. A knight's victory was often his slowest death. Still, they fought, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. War paid their debts, gave them food, gave them purpose, in a cruel twist. The same battlefields that destroyed them also kept them alive. They became tools of war, forged by pain and sharpened by survival. Even in so-called peace, knights trained for the next conflict. They practiced killing like breathing. Children born to knights were raised in the same way, to fight, to bleed, to die. It was a cycle no one escaped. The sword never left their hands, even when they wished to rest. And when the call to arms came again, they obeyed without question. Across misty hills and burning plains, armored lines formed like a steel tide. Trumpets blared, prayers were whispered, and the slaughter began anew. For every king who claimed victory, thousands of nameless knights rotted where they fell. History remembers the wars, but not the men who fought them. Behind every shining banner lies 1,000 silent graves. Their armor rusted, their swords buried, their oaths forgotten, but their suffering built the kingdoms that came after. For the medieval knight, war was not destiny, it was a curse that followed them from birth to death. They fought for lords who never knew their names, for causes they barely understood, for glories that turned to dust. The songs of victory lied, the truth was pain, endless and unrelenting. To be a knight was to live on the edge of death every day, and to know that even in dying, the war would never end. The shining armor that made a knight look like a hero was, in truth, a prison forged of steel and sweat. Every piece, the helmet, breastplate, greaves, gauntlets, was crafted to protect. but it also tortured the man who wore it. A full suit could weigh up to 50 pounds, sometimes more, pressing down on his body like chains of iron. Walking in it was exhausting, fighting in it was agony, and living in it was hell. The sound of the armor clanking became the heartbeat of a knight's life, heavy, cold, and constant. The process of suiting up took nearly an hour, often with the help of squires. Straps bit into the flesh, buckles rubbed raw against skin, and every movement felt like dragging the weight of another man. Once the armor was sealed, there was no freedom, not even to scratch, drink, or breathe easily. The air inside grew thick and hot. The body became a furnace. Sweat dripped into the padding, soaking it until it smelled of salt and rot. When knights fought for hours, the stench of sweat and rust filled the battlefield like a storm. The helmet, the so-called crown of courage, was its own torment. It muffled sound, narrowed vision, and trapped every breath. Inside it, a knight could hear only his own heartbeat and the echo of his breath. Panic often crept in, a silent terror known only to those locked inside steel. In summer, the heat turned unbearable. Some fainted before the first clash of blades. Others suffocated, their lungs crushed by the very armor meant to protect them. But removing it was no simple task. After long battles, armor clung to the body like a second skin. The straps stuck to blood and sweat, tearing open wounds when unbuckled. The squires who helped remove it often gagged at the smell. Beneath the metal were blisters, bruises, and blackened skin. Infection spread fast. One cut, one sore, and death followed in days. Knights feared infection more than swords. Steel could be blocked, but disease always won. Even in times of peace, they could not escape the weight. Knights wore armor in ceremonies, in tournaments, even while traveling. The constant burden twisted their spines, damaged joints, and crushed nerves. Old knights limped, their bodies broken long before their spirits faded. Beneath the glory of the armor, every knight carried invisible pain. The armor also became a curse in battle. When rain turned the ground to mud, it trapped the knights like statues. They fell and couldn't rise. Squires and enemies alike watched them sink slowly, their cries muffled inside the helmet. Many drowned in inches of muddy water, their heavy suits dragging them down. No one wrote songs about those deaths. They were too humiliating for history to remember. During sieges, armor turned into an oven. The fire from torches and flaming arrows heated the steel until it burned the skin beneath. Some knights removed pieces mid-battle, choosing exposure over roasting alive. Others fought half-naked, their faith in steel shattered by the pain it caused. Every piece of armor had to be maintained. Rust spread quickly, and repairing even a small dent cost more than most peasants earned in a year. Squires spent, knights polishing metal, oiling hinges, and praying it would hold. A cracked breastplate meant certain death. A loose strap could end a legacy. The knight trusted his armor more than his own faith, and feared it just as much. Armor was status, yes, but it was also a curse of expectation. The heavier the armor, the richer the knight appeared, and the more he was sent to the front lines. Lords expected him to lead charges, to break enemy lines, to die first. His shining suit made him a target for archers, mercenaries, and fate itself. Many knights envied foot soldiers who could run, breathe, and hide. Underneath all that steel was not a hero, just a human being gasping for air. The armor hid everything: the fear, the pain, the exhaustion. To the world, the knight looked indestructible. Inside, he was dying slowly, crushed by the symbol of his own glory. And when the armor finally came off for the last time, when the squire laid the steel aside and saw the broken man beneath it, all illusions vanished. The armor did not make the knight immortal. It only prolonged his suffering. The legends speak of knights gleaming under the sun, fearless and noble. The truth is far colder. Every gleam came from blood, every shine from sweat, and every victory from pain. Beneath the metal, they were men trapped, tormented, and forgotten by time. To wear the armor was to carry both protection and punishment. It was not a gift, but a sentence, one that every knight had to bear until his final breath. The code of chivalry, it sounded noble, holy, and pure. It promised honor, mercy, and virtue. It painted the knight as a protector of the weak and servant of justice. But in reality, it was a beautiful lie written by poets and priests. a golden mask covering a world of cruelty. Knights swore to live by it, but few truly did. For them, chivalry was not a moral compass, it was a costume. It made them appear righteous while hiding the rot underneath. Every word of the code was twisted to serve those in power. Kings praised it when knights obeyed, and ignored it when they didn't. The idea of protecting the weak was laughable in the Middle Ages. The weak were peasants, and peasants were property. Knights collected taxes from them, beat them for disobedience, and burned their homes during war. To defend them meant losing money, and few knights would dare. Chivalry taught compassion in words, but cruelty in deeds. It was meant to tame beasts, but it created hypocrites instead. The church blessed the sword of every knight, calling it holy. They claimed every battle was for God's will. But how could God bless murder and pillage? The Crusades proved the truth. Religion was just another excuse for bloodshed. Knights slaughtered innocents while priests sang hymns nearby. They were told their sins would be forgiven if their blades served heaven. So, they killed without guilt. The cross on their chest became a license to destroy. Faith and fury blended into madness, and a code of chivalry stood silent through it all. Mercy was another illusion. In songs, knights spared the defeated. In truth, they looted corpses and finished the wounded. Prisoners were valuable only for ransom. If no gold was offered, their throats were cut before sunrise. Compassion had no place on a battlefield. Only survival mattered. Every knight who lived long enough learned this truth the hard way. The code taught forgiveness, but war taught fear, and fear always won. Loyalty was sacred, but to whom? To one's lord, one's king, one's god. The code demanded all three, yet they often opposed each other. Knights were torn apart by conflicting oaths. A king ordered war while the church preached peace. A lord demanded tribute while peasants starved. Whom should a knight obey? Whichever hand held the power, and the gold. Honor became currency, and loyalty was just another weapon. Even love, the romantic dream sung by bards, was twisted by chivalry. Knights wrote letters to ladies they barely knew. They swore eternal devotion while spilling blood for glory. Marriage was politics, affection was weakness. Behind castle walls, women feared the men who called themselves protectors. The same code that demanded respect also excused control. Knighthood made men believe they owned not only land, but people, and they used that belief to justify anything. Chivalry, in the end, was never about love. It was about dominance dressed in poetry. For the few who truly tried to live by the code, life was misery. Their honesty was mocked. Their mercy was punished. A merciful knight died faster than a cruel one. An honest one starved while the greedy grew rich. The world did not reward virtue, it devoured it. And a code that promised salvation became their curse. They fought for ideals the world did not want. Their stories faded while liars became legends. Honor was not earned, it was bought. Tournaments and feasts glorified the code. Poets sang of noble knights and loyal hearts. But none of those poets had seen a real battlefield. They had never heard the cries of dying men. They had never seen a knight loot the church he prayed in. The songs were lies, comfort for the rich, distraction for the poor. And a code became the tool to control them all. It was a weapon of illusion sharper than any sword. Every line of it served power. Every promise was a chain. The true knight lived trapped between guilt and duty. He wanted to believe in the ideals he swore to uphold, but every battle proved them false. Every dead child, every burned village, every shattered oath, they carved truth deeper into his heart. The code was not salvation. It was shackles. It made men slaves to honor that didn't exist. It turned killers into heroes and sinners into saints. It was the greatest lie history ever wrote. When the knight finally looked at his reflection, not in polished steel, but in bloodied water, he saw what he had become. Not a noble warrior, not a servant of God, just another man lost in the darkness of duty. The code had promised light, but gave only shadows. And beneath those shadows, the knight's soul wept for the truth. Chivalry had not saved the world. It had broken it. Honor, the one word every knight lived and died for. Yet it was the most expensive illusion in the medieval world. To hold honor meant to bleed for it, to starve for it, and often to die defending it for someone else's pride. Every drop of a knight's blood had a price, and the cruelest truth was that honor was never paid in gold, it was paid in pain. From the moment a boy swore his oath, he belonged not to himself, but to a system that fed on his loyalty. Lords demanded courage, kings demanded obedience, and the church demanded purity. There was no room left for the man beneath the armor. His choices ended the day his sword was blessed. Every battle was a transaction. A knight's duty was to spill blood for a cause he rarely understood. The banners might change, but the price was always the same: sweat, fear, and death. He could not retreat, even when his comrades fell beside him. Retreat meant dishonor, and dishonor was worse than death. The weight of reputation crushed him harder than any armor. To be called a coward was a wound deeper than any blade could cut. So he charged again and again, into spears, into arrows, into certain doom, because his name depended on it. The concept of honor turned men into sacrifices. A knight could lose everything: land, wealth, even family, but not honor. It was a disease that spread through generations. A silent curse fathers passed to sons. When a knight's honor was questioned, duels were fought, blood spilled, and lives wasted. One insult could destroy a lineage, so they killed not for justice, but for pride. And when the killing was done, they called it righteousness. The price of that pride was unimaginable: the upkeep of armor. Horses, servants, and weapons drained every coin a knight earned. Many went into debt to appear honorable. Their castles crumbled while their armor shone. They feasted with nobles one day and starved the next. Some sold family heirlooms. Others borrowed from merchants, trading their future for the illusion of dignity. Honor demanded appearances, and appearances demanded sacrifice. It was a cycle that devoured even the richest knights. To maintain that image, knights fought in tournaments for money and recognition. The crowds cheered, banners flew, and music echoed through the fields. But beneath the spectacle was desperation. Every lance broken was a gamble, every injury another debt. Some knights died trying to win the gold purse that would keep their estates alive. Others cheated, bribed, or sabotaged their rivals. Honor was spoken loudly, but corruption whispered louder. Even in victory, honor offered no peace. The blood on their hands haunted them, and the ghosts of those they killed followed them through sleepless nights. The church told them to confess, to repent, to pray. But how could prayers wash away rivers of blood? The priests who blessed their swords were the same ones who condemned them for using them. The hypocrisy of faith gnawed at the edges of their souls. They wanted salvation, but their entire life was built on sin. Many knights sought redemption in crusades, believing holy war could cleanse their guilt. They traveled across seas, leaving behind families and fortune, chasing divine forgiveness. But when they reached the Holy Lands, they found the same hunger, greed, and slaughter that had poisoned Europe. The sand ran red, and the heat burned through their hope. By the time they returned, the only thing they had gained was trauma. Their honor was intact, but their humanity was gone. For some, the cost of honor was madness. They spoke to ghosts, feared shadows, and drank themselves into oblivion. The battlefield never left their minds, even in silence. They heard the clash of steel, the screams, the prayers. Every scar on their body was a memory they wished to forget. Yet society praised them as heroes. They smiled at feasts wearing their medals, while inside they rotted with guilt. And still, they taught their sons to follow the same path. Because without honor, what was a knight? The world left no room for peace. If a knight refused to fight, he was branded a coward. If he questioned his lord, he was a traitor. If he sought freedom, he was hunted. So he carried his sword not out of choice, but out of necessity. To survive, he had to keep killing. The cost of honor was not just personal, it was generational. Families fell into ruin, widows wept in cold castles, sons buried fathers who died for causes already forgotten. The word honor carved itself into tombstones like a cruel joke. The bards sang, the kings feasted, and the world moved on, but the graves remained. Every knight who ever lived paid the same price, his blood for someone else's legacy. Honor demanded everything and gave nothing. It took youth, strength, and peace, leaving only scars and stories. And yet, knights clung to it because it was all they had. Without it, their lives would seem meaningless. It was the only currency they could spend in a world that valued death more than decency. So, when you picture a knight kneeling before his king, remember what that moment truly meant. It was not devotion, it was surrender, a silent acceptance that his life no longer belonged to him. The sword at his side was not a weapon of justice, it was a receipt of debt. Every battle would be another payment, every wound another signature. And when he finally lay dying on the field, bleeding into the earth, he might whisper the word honor one last time, not as triumph, but as regret. For in truth, it had cost him everything he ever was. That was the real price of blood, the currency of a world that worshipped war and called it virtue. Knighthood was often glorified as freedom, a man of valor riding wherever honor called. But in truth, knights were not free men. They were bound, chained not by iron, but by obligation. Behind every shining sword stood a lord who pulled the strings. The knight's loyalty was not a matter of choice. It was a contract written in blood and fear. For all their pride and armor, they were servants in disguise, pawns in a game played by the powerful. From the moment a squire took his oath, his fate was sealed. He belonged to his liege lord, a noble who controlled his land, his duty, even his life. The knight might command men in battle, but before his lord, he was nothing more than a weapon. Every victory belonged to the lord, every failure was the knight's alone. It was a cruel hierarchy, one that fed on submission and disguised obedience as loyalty. Knights were expected to serve unquestioningly. When their lords demanded war, they marched. When they demanded taxes, they paid. When they demanded silence, they obeyed. To defy one's lord was treason, and treason meant death. Even if the command was unjust, even if it went against faith or conscience, a knight's word of loyalty bound him tighter than any shackle. In return, lords promised protection, but that protection was an illusion. When battles were lost, knights were left behind to die while their masters fled to safety. When famine struck, it was the peasants and knights who starved first. The higher you rose in rank, the colder the world became. Lords feasted while knights bled. They called it the natural order, ordained by God, and none dared question it. A knight's life revolved around endless servitude. He trained, fought, and suffered not for his own glory, but for his lord's ambition. The castles he defended were not his. The land he guarded was not his. Even the peasants who toiled beneath him were subjects of the Lord. He might ride with banners of pride, but the crest stitched upon them was never his own. When war came, the Lord sat in his hall, while the knight rode into fire. When peace returned, the Lord reaped wealth, while the knight returned to debt and decay. It was a cruel balance, one man's title built upon another man's suffering. Knights learned quickly that loyalty was a double-edged sword. Serve faithfully and be forgotten. Disobey once and be destroyed. The feudal bond was designed to keep them chained. A knight could not simply leave his service. His name, land, and family were tied to it. Some were forced to marry for alliances, not love. Others were sent across seas to fight wars that had nothing to do with them. Their destinies were written by quills held in noble hands. They carried swords, but they had no power. Many knights began to question this system, whispering doubts in candlelit halls. But those whispers were dangerous. The church declared loyalty divine and rebellion heresy. To question your Lord was to question God himself. So they stayed silent, biting their tongues while watching injustice flourish. The same hands that prayed were forced to kill, and the same lips that swore loyalty cursed their fate in secret. Some tried to escape, fleeing their oaths, becoming mercenaries or outlaws. But freedom was a mirage. Without the protection of their lords, they became hunted men, stripped of title and honor. The world saw them not as victims, but as traitors. To live without a master was to live without identity. Even the poorest peasant belonged somewhere. A knight without allegiance was a ghost. The cruelty of servitude extended beyond the battlefield. Lords used knights as pawns in political games, sending them to guard borders, collect taxes, or enforce cruel laws. They became tools of oppression, forced to harm the very people they once swore to protect. Some knights turned cold, losing their humanity. Others broke inside, realizing they had become the monsters they once fought. It was a system built on fear and tradition. Every knight dreamed of rising higher, earning land and title of his own. But few ever did. Most died before they could even taste the freedom they were promised. Those who survived long enough to gain land soon found themselves repeating the same cruelty, becoming the very lords they once despised. The cycle continued, generation after generation, built on servitude disguised as loyalty. Even their victories were not their own. When knights returned home, wounded and weary, they were greeted with hollow praise. The songs of the bards celebrated their courage, but their names were often forgotten in the verses. The glory went to the lords who never raised a blade. The knight's scars faded into history, and his sacrifices were buried beneath someone else's triumph. In time, some knights began to realize that true chains were not made of metal, but of belief. They had been raised to worship authority, to obey without question, to equate loyalty with virtue. It took a lifetime of pain to see that obedience was their prison. But by the time they saw it clearly, it was too late. Their youth was gone, their bodies broken, their names forgotten. At night, in cold stone chambers, many knights prayed not for victory, but for peace, the kind that could only come with death. Their dreams were haunted by banners and battle cries, their souls heavy with regret. They had lived for others, fought for others, died for others, and for what? A name carved on a gravestone under someone else's flag. Such was the life of a knight, chained by duty, crushed by loyalty, devoured by power. They called it honor. The truth was, it was slavery with a shining sword. And as time passed, even the most faithful began to whisper, perhaps it is better to die free than to live loyal. To the world, a knight's armor was a symbol of strength, a gleaming cage of honor that separated him from the common man. But for the one wearing it, that shining metal was more curse than blessing. It clung to his skin like punishment, heavy, suffocating, relentless. What people saw as glory, the knight knew as torment. Every clang of steel was not triumph, it was the sound of chains. The process of putting on armor was agony in itself. It could take a squire and to servants nearly an hour to fit every plate, strap and buckle. The weight often reached 60 pounds or more, pressing down like the judgment of God. Once the final helm closed over his head, the world vanished into a muffled echo. Breathing became shallow, vision narrowed to slits. Sweat filled the padding beneath. Soaking through the linen, the knight became less man and more machine, a creature made for war and nothing else. Every movement was a battle. Walking required strength, mounting a horse demanded precision, and fighting was a test of endurance that few survived. The armor turned the body into a furnace. Under the sun, the metal heated until it burned the flesh beneath. During winter, it froze so cold that joints stiffened and muscles screamed. Yet the knight could not complain. Weakness was shame. Pain was part of the code. On the battlefield, armor saved lives, but it also trapped them. When a knight fell, the same plates that protected him became his tomb. Many drowned face first in mud, unable to lift themselves. Others suffocated beneath the weight after being knocked from their horses. Rescue was rare. The battle moved on, leaving the fallen to die in silence. The last sounds they heard were their own labored breaths, echoing inside the helmet, a hollow reminder that their strength had become their coffin. Even in peace, the armor ruled their existence. It needed constant cleaning, oiling, and repair. Rust crept in like disease, and every dent told a story of pain. The cost of maintenance was staggering. Only the wealthy could afford it. For poorer knights, it meant selling land or food just to keep the plates polished. Some even wore patched armor made from the corpses of fallen comrades, their protection stitched from death itself. The armor also erased humanity. Beneath the helmet, no one saw the man, only the symbol. It made knights faceless, voiceless, and replaceable. A lord didn't care who fought, as long as the armor looked loyal. On the battlefield, you couldn't tell friend from foe until it was too late. A knight could kill his own kin in the chaos, blinded by the glint of steel. And when he returned home, the people cheered for the armor, not the man inside. That dehumanization broke many spirits. The knight became a shadow, a walking emblem of war. His identity was buried under layers of metal and expectation. When he removed the armor, the world treated him differently, smaller, weaker, insignificant. Without the shining plates, He was just another man with scars and debts. So he wore it even when it hurt, even when it consumed him, because it was the only thing that gave him worth. At night, when the armor hung beside his bed, it loomed like a ghost. In the dim candlelight, the helmet's hollow eyes stared back, reminding him of who he had become, not a hero, but a prisoner of his own legend. The creak of the metal haunted his dreams. Some knights claimed they could still feel the weight even when naked, as if their souls had been welded into the steel. During campaigns, knights slept in fragments of armor, afraid of surprise attacks. The constant pressure carved sores into their skin. Infection was common. Rot spread beneath the padding. Many died not from swords, but from the filth trapped inside their armor. Fleas and lice nested within the cloth, and sweat baked into a stench that clung for weeks. The armor protected their flesh but poisoned their bodies. And yet, despite the pain, they couldn't abandon it. To appear without armor was to appear weak. Every knight was judged by the gleam of his plates, not the content of his heart. The dirtier the armor, the lower his worth in the eyes of nobles. Some spent more time polishing than praying, desperate to maintain the illusion of power. As years passed, the armor grew heavier, not just physically, but symbolically. It carried the weight of guilt, regret, and duty. Each dent was a memory of someone who never rose again. Each scratch was a whisper of fear. The knight might have looked invincible, but inside, he was breaking. The armor that once made him feel powerful now reminded him how trapped he truly was. The irony was cruel. Armor was meant to protect life, but it drained the very humanity it shielded. The man beneath it faded away, until all that remained was the legend of the knight, a hollow echo inside a shell of steel. And the world loved that illusion. They admired the armor, worshipped the idea, and forgot the suffering soul imprisoned within. When a knight finally fell in battle, his armor was stripped from his corpse, cleaned, and handed to the next warrior. The man was forgotten. The metal lived on. The same plates that had once carried one man's dreams now carried another's. Doom! It was a cycle of suffering, a legacy forged in iron and grief. So next time you picture a knight shining under the sun, remember, that shine came from sweat, blood, and tears. Behind the polished steel was not a hero, but a man suffocating in silence, trapped inside the very thing that was supposed to protect him. The armor was not his salvation. It was his prison. Beneath the steel and splendor of knighthood, the body of a medieval warrior was a battlefield of its own, scarred, infected, and decaying long before the sword ever struck. The truth no one sang about in ballads was that death did not always come from an enemy's blade. It came from rot, from fever, from the slow decay of flesh hidden beneath the armor of honor. Being a knight was not just a fight against foes, it was a daily war against disease, exhaustion, and time itself. Every wound carried the whisper of death. In an age without proper medicine, even a small cut could fester into a killing infection. The mixture of dirt, sweat, and blood created the perfect breeding ground for sickness. Armor rubbed skin raw, open sores became infected within days. Flies swarmed to the smell of rot, and maggots were often found beneath bandages. The bravest knight could fall not on the battlefield, but in his own bed, consumed by fever from a wound he thought had healed. Physicians were few, and those who existed relied more on superstition than science. Leeches, bleeding, and prayers were the remedies of the day. A knight's body was a canvas of failed cures, scars of cauterized flesh, blackened veins, missing limbs. Some knights had more metal nails than bones holding them together. They were walking relics of pain, clinging to life by stubborn will alone. The diet of a knight made matters worse. Feasts were rare. Famine was constant. They consumed salted meat, stale bread, and watered wine, food that filled the stomach but poisoned the blood. Malnutrition weakened even the strongest warriors. Teeth rotted, gums bled, and stomachs rebelled. The richer the lord, the heavier the food, and the sicker his knights became. The very wealth they fought for corroded their bodies from within. On campaign, disease struck harder than swords. Dysentery, typhus, and plague spread through camps like wildfire. The smell of death hung over every tent. A knight could wake surrounded by comrades, and sleep surrounded by corpses. They burned the dead in pits. But the smoke carried sickness through the ranks. No amount of armor could stop an invisible enemy. The Black Death alone wiped out entire orders of knights, leaving behind empty castles and ghostly banners fluttering over graveyards. Even the sacred crusades, promised as holy journeys, became crawling grounds for disease. Knights who left Europe to fight for God often never made it back. They died not in glorious battle, but in swamps of filth, their faith rotting with their bodies. The heat boiled them inside their armor, the wounds blistered, and infections turned their flesh black. Those who survived returned home unrecognizable, walking skeletons haunted by what they'd seen. Injuries that should have healed instead became lifelong curses. Broken bones never set properly. Joints swelled with arthritis, and every winter brought agony. Some knights' hands trembled so badly they couldn't lift their swords, yet they were expected to fight. Others went blind from infection, deaf from explosions of siege cannons, or lost limbs that turned septic. The body of a veteran knight was a museum of suffering. Their mental wounds were even worse. The medieval world had no word for trauma, no cure for the endless nightmares. Knights who returned home could not sleep. The screams of the dying echoed in their minds. They prayed, drank, and fought their memories, but peace never came. Villages celebrated their return, but behind closed doors they shook, cried, and broke. Many took their own lives, unable to bear the silence after years of slaughter. The church told them their suffering was divine, a test of faith. They were told to endure, to pray harder, to confess more, but prayers did not heal rotting flesh or soothe trembling hands. Faith gave them strength to die, not to live. The promise of heaven was the only relief they were offered, a cruel comfort for men dying in agony. The disease was not only in their bodies, it was in their way of life. The very system that glorified war was infected with decay. Lords and kings used knights as expendable shields, sending them to die for land and gold while pretending it was for honor. And the knights accepted it because that's what they had been taught since childhood, that pain was proof of purpose, that suffering was sacred. Even the armor that once protected them became their coffin. When fever struck, the heat inside the plates cooked them alive. Some knights were found dead on the battlefield with no visible wounds, killed by dehydration and infection. Others were buried still in their armor, sealed forever inside the steel that had both protected and killed them. The rot extended to the very heart of their world. Dirty water, polluted air, and disease-filled streets ensured that even peace was deadly. A knight could survive 100 battles but die from drinking from the wrong well. Rats spread sickness. Faster than armies could march. Plagues did not discriminate between peasant and noble, but it was the knights who carried it across lands, spreading death as they sought glory. The greatest irony was that while bards sang of courage and victory, no one sang of the disease that stalked behind every triumph. The stench of decay was hidden behind hymns of honor. The knights became symbols of purity while their bodies rotted from within. They smiled at feasts, while their bones ached and their wounds oozed beneath their tunics. They lived as legends but died as corpses, forgotten, unclean, and unnamed. For every shining tale of valor, there were 100 silent deaths from infection, fever, and despair. The glory of the night was built upon graves too small for songs, and when the wind blew through the ruins of their castles, it carried the whispers of their suffering, faint echoes of the truth no one dared to tell. The disease of knighthood was not just physical, it was spiritual. It consumed their bodies, their faith, and their hope. It turned heroes into husks, saints into sinners, and men into memories. The armor rusted, the flesh decayed, and the legend remained clean, noble, and false. Behind every knight's story of glory was a hidden truth buried in rot and silence. They did not die in honor, they died in pain. The world that had once worshipped the knight began to crumble beneath its own armor. The shining age of chivalry that poets praised and kings exploited slowly rusted away, leaving behind only rust, ruin, and regret. The knights had built their identity on swords, loyalty, and divine purpose. But time revealed that none of those things could withstand the march of change. The fall did not happen in a single battle. It was a slow, merciless decay, one law, one invention, one betrayal at a time. The first cracks appeared when the common man learned to fight back. Bows and crossbows turned peasants into killers of nobles. A single arrow could pierce. What gold? Could not protect. No amount of courage could save a knight from a peasant-s bolt shot from 100 yards away. On muddy fields, the proud cavalry fell, their horses screaming, their armor useless against the simple strength of wood and string. The myth of invincibility shattered, and with it, the meaning of the title knight. Gunpowder finished what the bow had started. The thunder of cannons silenced centuries of tradition. Castles that had stood for generations crumbled in hours. Plate armor melted before the heat of musket fire. Knights became relics, outdated and unwanted. The battlefield no longer needed honor. It needed efficiency. And there was no room for men bound by chivalry in a world run by gunpowder and greed. As warfare changed, so did society. Merchants grew richer than lords, cities rose higher than castles, and money replaced valor. The knight's code, once sacred, became a joke told by those who now ruled with coins instead of swords. Lords who had sworn eternal loyalty sold their titles to bankers. The world that had once demanded knights to die for honor now demanded them to pay taxes. Their estates crumbled, their lands were seized, and their armor became scrap metal. Many knights could not accept this fall. They clung to their oaths like drowning men clinging to broken shields. Some became mercenaries, selling their swords to the highest bidder. Others joined rebellions, trying to restore a dying age. But history had already moved on. Gunmen laughed at them. Kings ignored them. The once mighty warrior became a wandering relic, respected in stories, forgotten in life. In desperation, they turned to faith, hoping the church would preserve their worth. But even the church had changed. It no longer needed armored saints, it needed scholars, diplomats, and wealth. Knights became guards for monasteries or bodyguards for priests. Their swords, once symbols of holy war, now protected gold and documents. The sacred purpose of the knight dissolved into mere labor. Some retreated into legend. They polished their rusting armor, retold tales of past glory, and pretended the world still cared. Children listened in awe, but their eyes shone not with reverence, but with curiosity, like visitors peering at fossils of a forgotten beast. The knight became a museum piece before he even died. The decline was not just external, it was spiritual. The code of chivalry that had once guided them became hollow words. Courage turned to pride, loyalty to servitude, piety to hypocrisy. They had fought for a world that never truly existed, a fantasy built by poets and kings to control them. When that illusion broke, they saw the truth. They had spent their lives fighting for others. Power, not their own purpose. Old age was the cruelest enemy of all. The knight who had once thundered across battlefields now limped through empty halls. The castle walls echoed with silence where laughter and steel once rang. The banners faded, the torches went out, and the sword grew heavy in trembling hands. The world outside no longer spoke his language. The roar of cannons replaced the clash of steel, and parchment replaced courage. Some knights tried to pass on their legacy, training sons who would never need armor. The young men listened politely, then left for cities to become traders, scholars, or politicians. The father watched them go, realizing that the age of the sword had ended not with defeat, but with indifference. That was the cruelest death, not to be slain, but to be forgotten. The very symbols of their greatness turned against them. Castles became prisons for memory. Armor rusted into statues. Swords were melted down to make tools for farmers. The knight's grave became a tourist's curiosity. His name a footnote in dusty chronicles. The same people who once cheered his courage now laughed at his ignorance. Progress had buried honor beneath the cobblestones of modernity. And yet, in the fading twilight of that world, a strange peace settled. The wars ended, the blood dried, and the soil that had drunk so much death began to bloom again. For the first time in centuries, the land breathed without the weight of armor pressing into it. The knight as sacrifice had not been in vain. It had built the foundation of a more peaceful age, even if he never lived to see it. Still, there were moments when wind blew through the ruins of old castles, that it seemed the echoes of hooves and steel returned. The spirits of knights still rode there, invisible and eternal, reminding the living of the price of progress. For all their flaws and failures, they had embodied something the modern world lost: devotion, courage, and the willingness to die for something greater than themselves. But history has no mercy. The armor turned to dust, the oaths faded into myths, and the age of knights was over. What remained was only legend, and legend, though beautiful, is also a grave. The last knight died not on the battlefield, but in memory, and when his name was finally forgotten. So, to end the dream of chivalry, the world moved on, cleaner, faster, colder. The torch of glory was extinguished, and in its ashes lay the truth of every knight who had ever lived. He was born to serve, trained to suffer, and destined to vanish. That was the fall of the knight, when glory turned to dust. As the world turned its back on the age of chivalry, one last knight remained, not in body perhaps, but in spirit. His armor, dented and faded, caught the final rays of a dying sun. Around him, the world no longer cared for oaths or honor. It was a time of merchants, inventions, and men who counted gold instead of glories. But deep inside that weary soul, the flame of the old world still flickered, fragile, but unbroken. He stood alone on a forgotten hill, where countless banners once waved, and whispered the last words of a sacred promise to serve, to protect, to die with dignity. It was the last oath of knighthood, and no one was left to hear it. The knight had lived through everything, the rise of kings, the fall of empires, the screams of 1,000 dying men. He had fought for faith, then watched that same faith corrupt itself. He had defended lords who betrayed him, protected peasants who feared him, and buried friends who had believed that honor could never die. But now, standing amid ruins and silence, he realized the cruelest truth. The world never wanted knights. It only needed them until it could outgrow them. His life, his code, his blood, all had been tools in the hands of power. And yet, despite knowing this, he did not regret his path. For even if the world forgot him, he had lived by something greater than comfort. He had believed in meaning. The wind howled through broken walls, carrying with it the ghosts of the past. He could almost hear the laughter of squires, the clash of swords, the roar of war horses charging through the mud. He remembered feasts lit by torchlight, where men spoke of valor and women prayed for their safe return. He remembered the banners of his brothers, the weight of the cross upon his chest, the prayers whispered before dawn battles. Every sound, every memory, came rushing back like waves against a cliff, eroding his strength but reminding him that he had truly lived. But time is merciless. The knight's sword was no longer sharp, his shield no longer strong. His hands trembled not from fear, but from age. He was the last of his kind, a living relic in a world that spoke a language he could not understand. People looked at him with curiosity, not respect. Children laughed at his stories, and the new rulers, sitting in their marble halls, spoke of progress and modernity, words that meant nothing to a man whose worth had been measured in courage, not convenience. He could have hidden his armor, melted it down, become another nameless man. But he didn't. Instead, he wore it one last time. He mounted his old horse, frail and grey, and rode out to the hills where he had once trained as a boy. The land was quiet now, no wars, no cries, only peace. The kind of peace knights had died to create but never lived to see. He smiled bitterly, realizing that this was the final victory, and it no longer belonged to him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he dismounted and drove his sword into the earth. The blade, once bright with blood and glory, now shimmered faintly in the fading light. "Let it rest," he murmured, his voice trembling like the wind through dry leaves. "Let the steel sleep." He knelt, feeling the cool grass beneath his armor, and whispered the final prayer of knighthood, not for victory, not for salvation, but for remembrance. For even if the world forgot his name, he wanted it to remember what it once meant to stand for something pure. He closed his eyes, and in that silence, it was as if time paused. He saw again the faces of those he had loved and lost, comrades, brothers, even enemies, all bound by the same code that the world now mocked. For a fleeting moment, he felt them beside him, kneeling in the same vow, and then the wind carried them away, leaving only his armor gleaming faintly beneath the moonlight. In the end, there was no audience, no poet to immortalize him, no king to grant him favor. There was only the whisper of grass, the cry of an owl, and the steady heartbeat of the earth. The night fell still, his breath fading into the night. When dawn came, Villagers found him there, resting peacefully beside his buried sword, as if asleep. They didn't know his name. They buried him beneath a simple stone that read only, "Here lies one who kept his oath." Years turned into centuries. The hill became a meadow. The meadow became a village. The village grew into a city. And somewhere beneath its cobblestone streets, the knight's sword still slept, rust but unbroken, a silent witness to an age when men lived by honor, not survival. Travelers who passed the site sometimes felt an odd stillness in the air, as if unseen eyes watched with pride. The spirit of the knight lingered, not as a ghost of war, but as a whisper, reminding the living that courage, loyalty, and sacrifice were not myths, but choices. And though the world forgot his face, the essence of his oath lived on, in soldiers who fought for right instead of reward, in people who stood against injustice though the world mocked them, in dreamers who believed in something worth dying for. They were the new knights, not of steel and blood, but of conviction and heart. The last knight had died, but his soul had been reborn in every act of honor the world still dared to show. For the truth, cruel and beautiful, was this: being a knight was never about armor or titles. It was about bearing the weight of righteousness, even when it broke you. It was about keeping your word, even when the world no longer listened. It was about falling and standing again, until there was nothing left to stand for but the ideal itself. And so the story ends not in defeat, but in legacy. The knight's body turned to dust, but his vow, his final, unbroken oath, echoed through eternity. The world had moved on, but somewhere in every act of bravery, in every heart that refuses to bow to evil, the last knight still rides. He rides unseen, through the centuries, through silence, through history, for a true knight never dies.